Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bapak Ibu hadirin yang terhormat, terima kasih sudah kembali bergabung bersama kami, baik secara luring maupun daring. Tentunya dalam acara International Conference on Islam and Human Rights hari pertama. Boleh kita berikan tepuk tangan yang sangat meriah untuk hari ini?
Baik. Namun sebelumnya izinkan kami untuk mengucapkan salam hormat dan selamat datang kepada yang terhormat Menteri Agama Republik Indonesia, Bapak Yakut Khalil Qomas, dan Ketua Komnas HAM Republik Indonesia, Bapak Ahmad Taufan Damanik.
Yang kami hormati, Wakil Menteri Agama Republik Indonesia dan Wakil Ketua Eksternal dan Internal Komnas HAM Republik Indonesia. Yang kami hormati, Wakil Ketua LPSK.
Yang kami hormati pula para pejabat eselon 1 di lingkungan Kementerian Agama Republik Indonesia dan para komisioner Komnas HAM Republik Indonesia.
Yang kami hormati staf ahli, staf khusus, dan tenaga ahli Kementerian Agama Republik Indonesia.
Yang kami hormati para pejabat eselon 2 di lingkungan Kementerian Agama Republik Indonesia dan Komnas HAM Republik Indonesia. Dan seluruh hadirin tamu undangan berbahagia yang kami muliakan, baik yang hadir secara langsung dan juga secara daring di seluruh Indonesia.
Puji dan syukur senantiasa, marilah kita panjatkan kehadirat Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. Karena atas berkat limpahan rahmat dan karunia-Nya, di hari yang berbahagia ini, Jumat 10 Desember 2021, kita dapat berkumpul bersama dalam acara International Conference on Islam and Human Rights yang dilaksanakan secara langsung dari Ballroom Hotel Pullman, Jakarta Pusat dan juga disiarkan secara daring. Senang sekali bersama saya Dilestari dan rekan saya
Muhammad Mahmudi dapat memandu acara konferensi internasional hari ini hingga selesai nanti.
Bapak Ibu hadirin yang berbahagia, konferensi internasional ini merupakan rangkaian kegiatan dalam rangka menyediakan forum diskusi konsepsi hak asasi manusia dalam Islam, serta untuk mendeklarasikan komitmen Islam terhadap toleransi dan martabat kemanusiaan.
Hadirin yang kami hormati, selanjutnya mari kita simak bersama sambutan yang akan disampaikan oleh Ketua Komnas HAM Republik Indonesia. Kepada yang kami hormati, Bapak Ahmad Taufan Damanik, disilakan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, speakers and also participants of the international conference. As we know, today we commemorate the 73rd International Human Rights Day. This year, Komnas HAM took the theme, Human Rights, Tolerance, and Resilience amid the COVID-19 pandemic in commemoration of International Human Rights Day. The COVID-19 pandemic gave us momentum to show that the handling of the pandemic cannot rule out human rights, and the perspective of human rights can be the answer for a comprehensive pandemic handling that reaches all levels of society and left no one behind. Our founding fathers and mothers from the beginning had imagined Indonesia would become a modern state or modern country that applies the principle of democracy, human rights, and equality. Human rights is not a new thing for Indonesia because the noble culture of the Indonesian nation already contains human rights values, so that there is no need to contradict the values of human rights with the personality of Indonesia as a nation. Glorious Indonesia in the future is Indonesia that upholds and protects human rights values for all peoples. Along with the 73rd World Human Rights Days commemoration, Komnas HAM and the Ministry of Religious Affairs of the Republic Indonesia hold the International Conference on Islam and Human Rights on 10 and 11 December 2021. This event marks an important step for Indonesia. This conference is not just to affirm that there is no dichotomy or contradiction between human rights values and Islamic values, as well as the values of democracy and Islam, but also marks the initiative of Indonesia to encourage the Islamic world to contribute to the development of human rights perspective in the world. Indonesia must show its international leaderships, especially among Muslim countries, and plays its part to be the best model of Islamic discourse and practice on human rights that play an important role in the advancement of modern civilization that is religious and respect human values, justice, transparency, integrity, dignity, and equality. Therefore, the International Human Rights Day celebration must be served as a revolutionary momentum for change in thought, policies, and attitude of all of us, whether as a country, the community, or individuals. Together, in the spirit of national and international solidarity, the values of justice and democracy must be the breath of every movement of our life. I would like to convey our appreciation for the strong collaboration to the Minister of Religious Affairs, to the expert participants and speakers, the official and staff from the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and other participants and colleagues. May God Almighty always protect the entire nation of Indonesia. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Ya, terima kasih Bapak Ahmad Taufan Damanik, selaku Ketua Komnas HAM Republik Indonesia atas sambutan yang telah disampaikan.
Baik Bapak dan Ibu, selanjutnya mari kita simak dan dengarkan bersama pidato kunci yang akan disampaikan oleh Menteri Agama Republik Indonesia. Kepada yang terhormat Bapak Yakut Khalil Kaumas, disilahkan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan, Wite Tung Tien. His Excellency Secretary General of Ministry of Religious Affairs, His Excellency Chairman and Members National Human Rights Commission, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for me to be here to participate in this very important conference titled Islam and Human Rights. May I at the outset convey to you a happy World Human Rights Day, today 10 December 2021. We support and make sure strive for equality by reducing inequalities for advancing human rights. A happy World Human Rights Day, today 10 December 2021. We support and make sure strive for equality by reducing inequalities for advancing human rights. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, Indonesia is a country with the largest Muslim population in the world. Statistically, Islam is the majority in Indonesia. Muslim almost reaches 87% of the Indonesian population. However, Indonesia is not only for one religion, but for all religion and all beliefs. It is clear government serves all religion proportionally and professionally. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, as a multicultural and multireligious country, Indonesia is challenged to manage its diversity and socio-religious problems. One of them is the challenge of increasing extreme in society. That some people have an exclusive religious thought, who claim the truth for themselves only and blame others. This creates tension in society and impedes intra and interreligious harmony in Indonesia. To address this problem, we developed what is so-called religious moderation. Briefly, this is a perspective that brings people to have a middle way away from excessive or extreme ones. With religious moderations, people's religious way become tolerant, non-violent, respectful of culture, and have a strong national commitment. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, however, in the big picture, national religious harmony in Indonesia is still in a good condition. The annual National Survey of Religious Harmony depicts fluctuations in the harmony index year by year, but are still in good category, at 60 to 80 points. In 2021, the index is 72.39, increasing about 4.93 points from last year's, which reached 67.46 points. If we elaborate more deeply, the three dimensions that construct the religious harmony index are tolerance, equality, and cooperation. Interestingly, the value for the tolerance dimension is always the lowest among the other dimensions. This confirms that the problem of extreme is still there. This also emphasizes the need for strengthening and mainstreaming religious moderation. Strengthening religious moderation and tolerance requires the support of all parties. Mainstreaming religious moderation is not only in the task of the Ministry of Religious Affairs. This priority program has become our collective duty, all ministries, institutions, and society, as well, including human rights activists. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is worth noting that religious moderation is an effort to restore religious understanding and practice to be in accordance with its essence, namely to maintain human dignity and civilization, not the other way around. Meanwhile, in Islam, primarily right to live and respect human dignity is a basic human right recognized by Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala through this Quranic verse. Whosoever kills a human being without any reasonable or justifiable cause, manslaughter or corruption on earth, it is as though he had killed all mankind. Therefore, refer to the big topic of this conference, Islam is very much in line with human rights, or even human rights have been embedded in Islamic teachings. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, lastly, I thank you to all parties for conducting and joining this conference. I hope this conference blessing ideas and constructing steps of contribution to mankind and civilization. Thank you for your kind attention. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih tentunya kami ucapkan kepada Bapak Yakut Khalil Kaumas atas pidato yang telah disampaikan.
Bapak, Ibu yang kami hormati, kita akan rehat sejenak. Kami akan mulai sesi selanjutnya sesaat lagi. Adapun agenda selanjutnya yaitu plenary session yang pertama dengan tema Maqashidus Syariah sebagai acuan dan kerangka kerja Islam dan hak asasi manusia.
Dan sesi plenary kali ini akan menghadirkan narasumber. Narasumber yang pertama, Bapak Yahya Khalil Stakuf selaku Khatib AAM PBNU.
Kemudian Dr. Michael Wiener as Advisor on Freedom of Religion or Belief Rule of Law, Equality and Non-Discrimination, ICIHR.
Dr. Ibrahim Salama as Chief of ICIHR Human Rights Treaty Branch.
Dan Mrs. Fauzia Kufi as Human Rights Activist from Afghanistan. Dan yang akan menjadi moderator pada sesi plenari kali ini adalah Profesor Masdar Hilmi. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, kita akan bergabung kembali sesaat lagi.
Baik Bapak dan Ibu hadirin yang berbahagia, kita akan memulai plenary session tentunya dengan tema
Forthcoming Chairman of Nahdlatul Ulama. This is the short biography of Mr. Kiai Haji Yahya Khalil Stakuf, and let me read a brief biography of Dr. Ibrahim Salama. He is Chief of the Human Rights Treatises Branch at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, where he also leads the Faithful Rights Program. Previously, he headed the UN Secretariat for Preparatory Process of the 2009 United Nations World Congress Against Racism, a Durban Review Conference, and he was also independent expert of the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, and he was also elected as chairperson of the Intergovernmental Working Group on the Right to Development. The third speaker is Dr. Michael Wiener. He has been working at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights since 2006, and he has been a visiting fellow of Kellogg College at the University of Oxford. 11. He was one of the experts who participated in the consultations that drafted the Camden Principles on Freedom of Expression and Equality. He has also been working on the design and implementation of the Beirut Declaration on Faith for Rights and of the Rabat Plan of Action or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. And our last speaker is Mrs. Fauzia Kufi, if she is together with us. She is a member of Peace Negotiation Team representing Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And she is the author of Letters to My Daughters and the Favorite Daughter book, which is her autobiography. In 2016, she has been elected as president of IPU's Human Rights Committee. IPU works to promote democracy and peace around the world. She has been titled as Young Global Leader by World Economic Forum, Fearless Mind of 2013 by Times Magazine, and many more. She has been awarded many prestigious awards, including Woman of Knowledge, Minerva, and many more. She is the leader of a newly established political party called Nobel Prize, which is a great accomplishment. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce myself. Myself is Master Hilmi. Now I am the professor and rector of the State Islamic University of Sunan Ampel in Surabaya. And it is, of course, a great honor for me to chair this opportunity to Kiai Haji Yahya Khalil Stakuf to present his thinking and ideas about Maqashidus Sharia as a reference and framework of Islam and human rights for about 15 to 20 minutes. Time is yours. Silakan Pak Kiai.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Alhamdulillah, syukurillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, Sayyidina Maulana Muhammad ibn Abdullah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi mawala. Amma ba'd. Honorable speakers, honorable chairman, distinguished participants and guests, Excellency Honorable Minister of Religious Affairs of the Republic of Indonesia, Sharia clearly recognizes human rights. The idea that human beings, that a human being has rights given by birth is there all over the Sharia. And we have all kind of scriptural statements in the sources of Syariah, the Quran and the Hadith and others like various kind of ijma, a consensus among ulamas, and that shows the recognition to human rights. But when it comes to the development of discourse in Islamic law, then there came an idea of human rights in the context of Islamic social and political framework. That is why in the concepts of Maqashidus Sharia, we have these ideas of 5 principles or 5 purposes of Sharia, which are first, protection of faith, hifdud-din, protection of life, hifdun-nafs, protection of mind or intellect, hifdul-aql, protection of lineage, hifdun-nasl, protection of property, hifdul-mal. You see, let me just talk about one element, one point in these 5 principles of Maqashidus Sharia, which is the protection of faith. The idea within this concept, protection of faith or hifdud-din, practically in legal conceptualization or in jurisprudence, then is understood as the principle of protection of faith to Islam, and not necessarily protection to faith to others than Islam. That is why, for example, in the classical discourse of Islamic law, we have this law about punishment, about death punishment, death penalty to apostates, which goes to the principle of hifdud-din or protection of faith. So, how would we understand the relation between this classical discourse of Maqashidus Sharia with human rights? What we need to understand and recognize then is that there is a concept of human rights in one hand. It is one thing. But there is a concept of universal human rights, which is something new, actually. The concept of human rights in Islam, including what was recognized by the classical discourse of Islamic law and the discourse of Maqashidus Sharia, was something that comes to be established in the mindset of Muslim and in the discourse of Islamic law at the peak of the social political, the Islamic social political establishment in the past, namely before World War I. You see, before World War I, the global society was a jungle of political identities. What happened back then was that various different groups of identities were fighting each other in a political and military competition. Islam was 4 centuries fighting against Christianity back then and against Judaism and so forth because of this. And the order that existed back then was the order of power, where the strongs control the weaks, just that, without any rules-based order. And these dynamics of competitions between identities then led the world toward 2 great world wars with devastating destructions and tragedy. And it was this great tragedy because of these 2 great world wars that led international community toward an awareness of necessity to develop a new consensus, for a new world order. So in 1945, then the international community initiated what was then known as United Nations Charter. And then it was in June 1945. And then in October 1945, the organization, the United Nations organization, was established based on that United Nations Charter. And then in 1948, there was a resolution of the United Nations organization which is known as Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So universal human rights is something very new compared to the idea of human rights that was known before. It was recognized, the idea of the concept of universal human rights was firstly recognized just in 1948. It's just younger than the Republic of Indonesia itself. So it's something very new. Now, today, when we are discussing about human rights, then everybody, the expectation is for us to talk about universal human rights, about the understanding of human rights that is equal and undiscriminating among human beings, regardless the differences in any primordial backgrounds. So, but this idea of universal human rights, then was proven to be kind of not easy for Islamic world to accept. That's why in 1990, August the 5th, if I'm not there was a declaration promulgated by the OIC in Cairo. It was called the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam, which then stated that Islam has its own idea of human rights that is different from the one that was declared by the United Nations organization as a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And there was an accusation that the UDHR was more of Judeo-Christian based ideas, ideas that derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition in the West, and not fully respect, without fully respecting the Islamic tradition. So in the Cairo Declaration, then we can see various statements that demand a more exclusive, exclusive treatment to Islamic or Muslims community, such as demands to respect a Muslim community from the proselytism of other religion, something like that. And the demand to respect Islamic law, I would say, in an open, honest way, to respect Islamic tradition of discrimination, such as various kind of discrimination toward other religious adherents, respect to the law of, for example, the respect to the law of death punishment for apostates, for example, and the respect of the law on various different laws related to women, to women's rights and so forth, and family laws. Now, if we discussed, this kind of controversies based on various religious arguments, citing various scriptural texts and statements, then the discussion will go to no ends. What we need to raise now is a discussion about the realistic consequences, because now we are all facing to a political choice whether we want to continue in developing this new order initiated after the World War II, or we simply want to go back to the order or an order of pre-World War I world. Now, if we want to abandon this post-World War II order, then the consequence would be the destruction of all global civilization. If we want to go back to the jungle of competition of identities, then we will come to kill each other and destruct each other. And this kind of war, in fact, in reality, is not affordable anymore to the world. Now, what we need to discuss then is how we can find a common framework for us to coexist each other. So, what we need to do first is to identify what values that we do share each other, regardless the differences in our primordial background, in our religion. We can find, for example, values such as honesty to be a value that we do share each other. A value of justice, we do share each other, and so forth. Value of compassion or rahmah, we do share each other. Now let us recognize these shared values. And then let us think about values that we need to share, that we necessarily need to share if we want to coexist peacefully with each other. So, for example, we need the value of tolerance, because without tolerance, we cannot live peacefully next to others. The value of equality, we need to share, because discrimination will lead to anger and enmity, and dissatisfaction and so forth. Now, we need to share this kind of values. Now, after that, any values that we have differences with, then let us just tolerate each other. Like, for example, the differences that we have, between different religious communities about which day we should honor more. Muslims believe that Friday is the day we should honor. The Christian choose Sunday. The Jewish people choose Saturday, for example. This is something that we can have differences each other without risking any conflict between us, if we can simply tolerate each other on this. So, when we think about universal human rights, then we should also address, if we look at it from the perspective of Islamic discourse, then we should address various elements that the discourse of Islamic law, I would say, should adopt if we want to develop a workable Islamic framework on universal human rights. A framework that recognize the equality of rights and dignity between human beings. So, and that needs honesty for us to discuss about what is there and what is not there. We need to discuss, for example, why we should or should not, we should or should not drop this law in Islamic discourse about, for example, death punishment for apostates. We need to discuss about whether proselytizing of other religions should be allowed among Muslim communities or not. So these are issues that I believe are crucial for Islamic community and Islamic scholars to discuss, so we can move forward toward a truly just and harmonious world order based on respect for the equal dignity and rights between human beings. Thank you. Wallahul muwaffiq lakum bit-thariq. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yahya Khalil Saquf, who has given us a lot of interesting points in this topic, and compatibility between Islam and human rights, the context of normative as well as the Islamic tradition. Again, thank you very much. Now we are moving on to the second speaker, Honorable Dr. Michael Wiener and Dr. Ibrahim Salama. I'm not sure which one will come first, whether Dr. Salama or Dr. Wiener. I will do the opportunity. Okay, the first opportunity is for Dr. Ibrahim Salama. The time is yours between maybe, I'm not sure, 15 or 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Helmi. And thank you for the organizers to associate us in the United Nations in this important and timely brainstorming. I think it's a very needed discussion, and I think we were all enlightened by the deep and honest reflections of Professor Yahya Khalil Saquf from an Islamic perspective on what one can call the missing duties of reconsiderations and honest assessment of where to go from here in terms of, and I use his term, the need for a framework of a workable Islamic framework for universal human rights. I think in this formulation by Professor Saquf, there is the admission that there are tensions and there are complementarities, and that both need discussion in order to manage the tensions, if not to reduce them to the maximum, and also to enhance the complementarities. The way I will divide my time with Michael, with your permission, Professor Helmi, is that I will start by the general trajectory of the relationship between human rights and religions at large. I'm not speaking about Islam here. We'll come to the Islamic traditions probably at the end. And this will take 5-6 minutes. And then Michael Wiener will zoom on a United Nations initiative precisely to manage the relationship, both in its positive and tension sides between all religions and human rights, which is the Faithful Rights Framework, with some specific applications and commitments, many of which, very interestingly, and I assure you we didn't coordinate with Professor Shakov, but many of the commitments that are in this new document probably provide elements for answers for the very strategic question Mr. Stakov just mentioned. And then at the end, maybe we can come back to some concluding remarks about some Islamic content of this framework. So to concentrate on the trajectory of relationship between religion and human rights, again, I like very much the metaphor of Professor Shakov about the jungle of competing identities. That the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal, but although the modern notion of human rights is new, its content and its origins and its sources are deeply rooted in all traditions, including the faith traditions. However, I would characterize the trajectory of the relationship between religion and the United Nations as follows. First, there is a political history of conflicts and of disagreements. If you go back to the history of negotiating the Charter of the United Nations, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the main conventions on human rights, or the missing convention, there was a draft convention on religious intolerance which was abandoned because of the political disagreements. To go back to the jungle of identities, the world politically was divided between Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc, with different emphasis on what is the notion of human rights, and also with a very different attitude toward the place of religion in societies. The second manifestation of very troubled relationship between religion and the United Nations is the numerous reservations on international human rights treaties in the name of religion. And it is a fact, I have to admit, that most of these reservations come from Muslim countries. If you look at these reservations, they all indicate that we do not accept this or that provision because it is in conflict with Islamic law. And by the way, none of this is explained in which way exactly there is a conflict between these human rights provisions and Islamic law. The third element is that despite the fact that the UN politically, the famous mantra was, we do not do religion in the United Nations. And this was in the name of secularism. As much as religion is misunderstood in the United Nations, secularism also is misunderstood in reality, because it was taken in a doctrinal manner in many ways to be in opposition to religion, instead of being the neutrality and respect for all religions. So in a way, religion was always seen in the human rights documents and history and practice as a problem and not as a solution. While secularism, which was presented as a solution, started to develop in practice into a problem, not as a solution. So you see the conflicting trends here. We also have a very interesting founding paragraph in the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action of 1993, which established the modern architecture of human rights. And this paragraph says that cultural and religious particularities should be taken into consideration when drafting and implementing human rights standards. But at the same time, they cannot be used as a waiver or as a pretext to violate universal human rights. So this paragraph, in a very diplomatic way, in an ambiguous manner, tries to say there are tensions and there are complementarities, but we're not quite sure how to delimitate this from that. The practice, however, so this is the legal and political trajectory. Lack of conceptual clarity, political tensions, political manipulations in the name of religion as well by different quarters. But at the same time, on the ground, the international community took some time to realize that religion is a very powerful term of reference. It's part of the identity and the beliefs, and that nobody should be required to abandon his or her beliefs and their practice in the name of human rights, as much as nobody can invoke his or her religion or belief to justify violations of human rights. So how to get out of this circular situation? There is a duty of reflection that was not completed till the end, up till very lately. Let me tell you something anecdotal. I tried to do the same exercise, Professor Halmi, of the brainstorming. And at that time, I was coordinator of the OIC in Geneva. And that was in 1998. And at that time, it was the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we took the initiative of the OIC to organize a seminar on Islamic perspectives to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that was 24 years ago. And I can tell you that we were raising the same questions, but there was no debate, frankly speaking. We were just stating positions. Do you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry. What I wanted to say is that even the attempts on behalf of the OIC and many other quarters, I'm really not talking about Islam alone, to demystify the relationship between religion and human rights were predominantly either apologetic or confrontational. And the middle ground could have only been reached if one could introduce the notion of Maqasid al-Sharia. This is why I admired the concept note of this brainstorming, because it really admits that there is an unfinished business in terms of conceptual clarity and honest assessment of what Islam can bring to humans, a product of Western culture and civilization. As Professor Shakov said it, this was the case. There is this perception, predominantly in the Muslim world as well, but not only limited to the Muslim world. Many other traditional societies and parts of the world do feel that there is a type of cultural hegemony and that human rights are a product of a Judeo-Christian civilization. The only way to prove this perception wrong is by contributing from all faith traditions into the human rights discourse. The very notion of using Maqasid al-Sharia is very promising in terms of defining the tensions and answering the right questions to provide the right answers. This is precisely what the Faithful Rights Framework tried to achieve, and I will hand over now at this stage for my colleague and the co-pilot on this initiative, Michael Wiener, to shed light on where it came from, what it says, and what were the lessons we took from its implementation and piloting. With your permission, Professor Halmi, Michael, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Ibrahim. And I want to pick up precisely on that point and bring it back to the very pertinent double question that Yahya Khalil-Stokov asked in the beginning. So how can we find a common framework for coexisting with each other, and what values do we share in that context? And I think that's, by chance, is very much resonating with the rationale behind the Faithful Rights Framework, because there, similarly, various religious leaders, faith-based actors, civil society representatives, and human rights mechanisms actually came together in 2017 to draft jointly and to discuss and to refine and to implement this Faithful Rights Framework. So with your permission, I will zoom into that and explain a bit some of the substantive arguments and also the way the religious and the human rights messages coincide. Because I think it's a important and not only symbolical way to have 18 commitments on faithful rights. So 18 as a number alludes to Article 18, which is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the article on freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. But then to have these 18 legal human rights commitments and have them supported by a variety of religious or philosophical texts and spiritual scriptures, including from the Quran and other religious texts. And I think at the end, Ibrahim will again zoom into the specific Islamic quotes in the Faithful Rights framework. I will just briefly give you a glimpse and not a complete overview, because that is we don't have enough time for that, but to give you some ideas of what these 18 commitments on faithful rights are about. The first one is really to stand up and act for everyone's right to free choices, particularly everyone's freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief. So here again, what is fundamental is the freedom and the free choices, not only linked to freedom of religion or belief, but obviously this is at the core of the whole framework. Then the second commitment is to use this declaration as a common minimum standard of interaction between theistic, non-theistic, atheistic, or other believers. And here again, we have an important also clarification of who is protected under international human rights law. And there it's not only the religious, the theistic believers, but any other believer whatsoever, also in terms of inter and intra-religious diversity, anyone is actually covered by the protection of Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then the third commitment is to promote constructive engagement on the understanding of religious texts through critical thinking and debate on religious matters. And that, as was mentioned earlier on, is also part and parcel of your concept note. The fourth commitment is to prevent the notions of state religion and doctrinal secularism. So basically, these are two flip sides of one coin, from being used to discriminate or reduce the space for diversity of religions and beliefs. The next one, which was also alluded to, is to ensure non-discrimination and gender equality, particularly regarding harmful stereotypes and practices or gender-based violence. And just to give you also, as a footnote, in the implementation framework, which is the Faithful Rights Toolkit, with a peer-to-peer learning methodology. This toolkit includes very hands-on and practical examples, and also positive impact of, for example, a fatwa by Al-Azhar on basically banning female genital mutilation and clarifying that this is not based on Islam and the Sharia. The sixth commitment is to stand up for the rights of all persons belonging to minorities and to defend their freedom of religion or belief, particularly in cultural, religious, social, and economic and public life. So this is obviously all-encompassing and also takes up a formulation by another United Nations declaration on the rights of persons belonging to minorities. The seventh commitment is to publicly denounce all instances of advocacy of hatred that incites to violence, discrimination, or hostility in the name of religion or belief. And here we have a very fundamental point of how to address or even to prevent incitement to hatred and violence. And here, another soft law instrument, which is called the Rabat Plan of Action, is at the core and is also explained further in the Faithful Rights Toolkit. Linked to that, we also have the commitment to monitor interpretations or other religious views that manifestly conflict with universal human rights norms and standards. and also to condemn any judgmental determination that disqualifies the religion or belief of another individual or community, exposing them to violence in the name of religion. So these are very much linked to the role and also particular responsibility of religious leaders in addressing violence committed in the name of religion. Linked to politicization, there's also the commitment not to tolerate exclusionary interpretations on religious grounds, which instrumentalize religions, beliefs, or their followers for electoral purposes. And also the commitment not to oppress critical voices on religious matters in the name of sanctity, and to advocate for repealing any anti-blasphemy and anti-apostasy laws. The commitment 12 is to review the curriculums and teaching materials wherever some of the religious interpretations seem to encourage or tolerate violence or discrimination. And that's obviously very much linking to the engagement with children and youth against violence in the name of religion, but also to promote their active participation in decision-making. Then we move, and I'll shortly finish just the last three commitments. 14 is to ensure humanitarian aid is given regardless of the recipient's creed, and that aid will not be used to further a particular religious standpoint. So that is obviously pertinent and really vital, also not to coerce people in vulnerable situations who should not be coerced into converting from their religion or belief, but at the same time, the right of everyone to have, adopt, or change a religion or belief as protected under Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights explicitly must also be protected. And the last one, which I think is really overarching and showcases the very great potential of positive impact from religious leaders and faith-based actors. This is the commitment to leverage the spiritual and moral weight of religions and beliefs in order to strengthen the protection of universal human rights and develop preventative strategies. So I think this is a very compelling and overarching framework of how the various religious or belief communities in all their diversity, both among each other and within each themselves, how they can really together join forces and work together for human rights. And my final point before just handing briefly back to Ibrahim is that the various religious or belief quotes that are put by in the Beirut Declaration on Faithful Rights. It's, I think, the first UN document which really both has the secular and the religious foundations so clearly spelled out with these religious texts under the various commitments on faithful rights. And Ibrahim will zoom into that question of the specific also Islamic quotes in that context. Over to you, Ibrahim.
Well, thank you very much for your succinct and clear presentation to Dr. Michael Wiener. Now, while we are waiting for the fourth speaker, that is Mrs. Fauzia Kufi, I don't think she is with us now. Then we should go to the question and answer session now. I will open up discussion for this seminar for the participants to ask question or to give comments on each of the presentation given by all speakers. Maybe the committee can help me to give the participants opportunity to ask question or to give comments on each of the participants. because I cannot see whether one of you, of the participants, is raising his or her hands, wanting to ask question. Kami minta tolong kepada panitia, apakah bisa dibantu untuk memberikan kesempatan kepada para peserta, para partisipan, apakah ingin memberikan pertanyaan atau komentar? Saya kira kalau tidak ada, if is there anyone of the participants who wants to ask or give comments?
Okay.
While waiting for we are waiting. Oh yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. I think there is a participant who.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Masdar. I'm Wawan Junaidi.
Okay. Could you please? Okay, Wawan Junaidi. All right. Please go on.
Okay. Thank you. As you told us, Kiai Yahya Sakub, about the Cairo Declaration, there is one article forbid Muslim to be murtad in the Cairo Declaration. How we can understand about this article with the ayah la ikraha fid din? So is contradictive with our Islamic values, or what? We can. I will know about the about your explanation about this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Wawan. The question is that he read an article discussing the question about murtad. I'm not quite sure whether this question is understandable to Pak Kiai.
I will try.
I'll try. Thank you very much.
Okay. You see, I mentioned that the understanding about the principle of protection of faith is more protection of faith to Islam, and not necessarily protection of faith to others than Islam. So that is why in the classical discourse of Islamic law, we still have this jurisprudence of death penalty to apostates. You know, the reason is, you see, I mentioned that in the past, before World War I, what the world had at that time was a jungle of competing identities. And there was, you know, in that context, you see, Islam is not just a religious framework, but it was also a political framework. What we have there, and it's not just the case for Islam, you know. Most of political system or states that existed back then were states with religious identity. So we had back then like Ottoman Turks with Islam, with identity of Islam, but we also have like the Spain with identity of Catholicism, and Netherlands, I think it was the identity of Protestantism, and the United Kingdom, the Britain with the identity of Anglican and so forth, you know, or some kingdom in India with Hinduism as identity, and somewhere else, kingdom with identity of Buddhism and so forth. And so the competition of identity, including the competition is among religions, then was translated into also political and military competition. That is why for not around 7 centuries, 700 years, the Ottoman Turks was in a constant military engagement against the Christian European kingdoms. Now, and it's not also that kind of dynamics was, started even long before in the history of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam himself, until the end of the Ottoman Turks. And one thing also is that back then there was no regime of borders. There was no rules about borders. So like I said, it was just order of powers. The strong, defeat the weak and control the weak. So now, because religions was inseparable framework of the political system, namely the kingdom, the state, and at the same time, the kingdom or the state was in a constant threat of attacks from neighboring countries with different identity of religions. So protecting first, military conflict against other country with other religious identity was the mechanism to protect the indigenous Muslims and citizens of Islamic State. Because without that, then the Muslims, the indigenous Muslims, the citizens of the Islamic State were not protected. Now, because the state, the Islamic states, was in a constant conflict against other religion, the state of other religion, then changing religion would mean switching loyalty. If you're a Muslim in Ottoman Turks, then you change your religion to Christianity when Ottoman Turk was in military conflicts against Christian kingdom. Then you're like, switching side to the enemy. So that was the logic of the law, which was justified by this idea of protection of faith. Now we have new order. We have no order where where we have now a nation-state model of other than theocracy or state of a religious state. So we need to think differently. And also now, we live in the same neighborhood with others, people of other religions. Back then, when Islam was in conflict against Christianity, such as what happened with the Ottoman Turk and maybe the crusade, the two crusades in the past, the actors of the conflict were professional soldiers, state soldiers, again, other state soldiers. And the conflict happened in a limited area of borders where, the battlefield, was there, where the battle happened. But now, if we allow conflicts among different religions, then that means we invite a social chaos, where people in the same neighborhood fighting each other. It will consequently, lead us to the destruction of the whole social order, and then to the destruction of the whole civilization. So that's why I believe, we Muslims, and especially this is the duty of Muslim scholars to think more, to find, like I said, a workable Islamic framework of universal human rights. Because universal human rights means recognition of equality, of rights and dignity between human beings. And that is precisely the prerequisite for us that will enable us to coexist peacefully with each other. So we need to review various kinds of jurisprudences in the classical Islamic law. And we can only do it with bearing in mind about the realistic consequences of the choice that we make. The choice, like I said, is whether we would continue to support and develop further this new post-World War II order, or we would demand to go back to the previous old order before World War I, such as what is demanded by this Hizb ut-Tahrir movement, for example, because they want universal Islamic caliphate. That means going back to the old order before World War I. So let's think about the realistic consequence. The realistic consequence would be universal destruction, would be the collapse of the whole human civilization. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the very clear answer from Pak Kiai Yahya Khalil Stakuf for the first question. And I see from the screen that Dr. Ibrahim Salama, raise your hands. Are you?
I have a question to Professor Yahya, unless there are questions from the floor. So please take the floor first if there is anybody from there.
Okay, then. Now.
There is another question from the floor. Some
okay,
questions.
this is
Okay.
Okay, I think. Could you please, for the committee, to help me to
I think the camera should cover the
share?
floor so that Mr. Chairman can see who raised
Yes.
hands.
Yes. Much. Okay. Could you please your name?
Thank you very much. I'm Anwar, and I would like to,
Ya, silakan.
I would like to ask Pak Kiai Haji Khalil Stakuf, Bapak Yahya Stakuf, about that some citizens that have opinion that Islam and culture is incompatible, and what I see in human rights is part of culture. So, and some say that Islam is a comprehensive way in life, and there is no Islam Nusantara or Islam which is, and that culture is part of religion or something. Could you elaborate on that so that I can understand about this situation? Thank you very much.
Okay, terima kasih. Thank you very much. I will give the directly to Pak Kiai. Silakan Pak Kiai.
Okay, thank you. The idea of Islam as a comprehensive guidance for life actually depends on the understanding of the meaning of Sharia itself. What is actually Sharia? If Sharia is understood as a particular, a distinctive set of values, different from any other kind of values, in an absolute way, then Islam would be an exclusive, entity. But you see, we have Sharia, but the Sharia is then should be broken down into what we call fiqh, the jurisprudence. Okay. Now, there are theories of law or legal theories that is known in the discourse of Islamic law, what we call usul fiqh, and set of principles in generating jurisprudence or law, what we call as qawaid al-fiqh, the principle of fiqh. Now, one very fundamental principle is that a law should be follow the legal reason. See, there is a principle that says al-hukm yaduru ma'illatihi wujudan wa adaman. A legal conclusion depends on the existence of legal reason. If there is a legal reasons, then we can generate a legal conclusion accordingly. Now, legal reasons is a concept that is, I would say, the illah or legal reason is a concept that I would say needs a further and deeper discussion among Muslim scholars, so that we can, we can respond to the new context of reality. So the way I see it, so to make it simpler, I would say that Sharia is anything that will bring well-beings to human life. And anything that against the well-being of human lives is against Sharia. That's the very basic principle that I would want to emphasize when we think about Sharia. And so if we think about the current context of our reality as a nation state, as citizens of the Unitarian, the unitary republic, the unitary nation of Republic of Indonesia, then for us, abiding by nation law is a Sharia obligation. So if you go against, or if you break law in Indonesia, that means you're not just facing punishment from the state, but you have sinned. Because it is a Sharia obligation to abide by national law, in the context of our existence as Indonesian citizens. Now, when we raised this discourse about Islam Nusantara, and this is actually not something new at all, Nahdlatul Ulama, my organization, raised that discourse in 2015, but actually there was a discourse about Islam Nusantara before and earlier, in the early 2000s. What we want is for us to see Islam in its multi-dimensional existence. That Islam is not just a set of laws. Islam is not just a set of theological framework, but Islam is also a civilization. And different societies can have different civilization. In any society that has its own distinctive, particular culture and civilization with a very strong color of Islamic tastes, can be named as Islamic civilization. And in Nusantara, we have this. We have Nusantara's distinctive particular culture with distinctive history, but very much colored by the taste of Islam. And it's not necessarily to be like in perfect match with whatever orthodoxy says about how we should express Islam. The expression of Islam can be very rich and varies in many ways. Such as, for example, Minangkabau is an Islamic civilization, is it not? If we said Minang is not Islam, Minang people would mad at you. Minangkabau is an Islamic civilization. But you see, the fact is they have this matriarchal system of family. Well, if you look at the orthodox fiqh, the classical discourse of fiqh, what we have is patriarchal system in family. How can an Islamic civilization such as Minangkabau can have its own family system different from what it is stated in the formal, teachings, also called, of Islam, So this is why we believe that we should learn more about Islam as a civilization, so that we can find, a better strategy how to integrate Islamic world into the modern reality of the 21st century civilization. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Kiai, for the answer. Now, I'm moving on to the participants, whether one of you who wants to ask question or to give comments on anything given by our speakers today. If not, I will go to Dr. Ibrahim Salama, please.
Maybe at this particular point, my question is even more pertinent to you, Professor Yahya. When you spoke about the need and the responsibility of Muslim scholars to reach a workable Islamic framework for universal human rights, this is very important. Can you elaborate more on the content and form of this framework? What type of framework? What could it look like? Number two, what kind of process do you think can concretely facilitate reaching this framework? And number three, do you envisage the reflection that you call for to reach that framework on a national level or in a pan-Islamic level? And I underline here your very welcomed emphasis on Islam as a civilization, on diversity within the Islamic societies, even within the same states. And a related question, because I see on daily basis when governments are asked about their Sharia reservations, they have so many different answers and they are rarely clear. So my question, fourth sub-question here, if you allow me, is do you think that experts from the international United Nations human rights system, their presence in this brainstorming or reflection or process that I ask you to shed light on, would their presence be useful so that it's not only among Muslims, the discussion, because Islam doesn't belong to Muslims, as you said, it's a universal heritage. And ultimately, I find that your definition of Sharia and Islam as a civilization is the most crucial missing conceptual foundation of renewal. It really reminds me of the first question the Prophet of Islam asked to his first ambassador, Sa'd ibn Abi Mu'adh, when he nominated him as his representative in Yemen. ماذا تقضي إذا عن لك أمر ولم تجده في كتاب الله وسنته؟ قال أجتهد رأيي ولا آله. قال الحمد لله الذي وفق رسول الله لما يرضي الله ورسوله. Over to you, Professor.
Wow,
thank you very much.
There are 4 questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Salama, for it's an honor to take questions from you, actually. So, but Professor, like you, what I have are also just questions, because I don't know if I'm a qualified person to to give answers to such, fundamental questions. But let me tell you what we have now, you see, what the Nahdlatul Ulama, has now. In 2017, the young adult movement of Nahdlatul Ulama, the Gerakan Pemuda Ansor, promulgated a declaration that was called the Gerakan Pemuda Ansor Declaration of Humanitarian Islam, which then translated into a movement, a global movement. Now, what was in the declaration was a set of statements related to the problem that we have between Islam and the current context of civilization. So, and then in that declaration, we identified 4 centers of concern in this regard. First, the first concern is about issues around the status of non-Muslim, in the perspective of Islam. Because what was dominant in Islamic discourse is that non-Muslims is subject to discrimination. It was there. That's why we have all this, banning to proselytism of other religion. We have, the law of death penalty for the apostate and so forth. Because the dominant discourse was that non-Muslim is subject to discrimination. So this is something very crucial. Now, the second center of concerns is related to the status of state. Now we have nation states as the foundational structure of world order. Is this model of state is acceptable from Islamic perspective, or do we as Muslims have the obligation to strive for a universal caliphate, Islamic caliphate? The third concern related to the position of Sharia vis-a-vis the state laws. Do we as Muslims have the obligation to abide by national law, even when there is a contradiction between some elements in the national laws against what we understand is the Sharia. The fourth center of concern related to conflicts. When there is a conflict between a group of Muslims against a group of non-Muslims for any reason, especially for religious reason, what is our obligation as Muslims? Do we have to join the conflict in the name of helping our fellow Muslims? Or should we do, other ways? Now, these are centers of concern which, if we do not address them, then the difficulties of integrating Islam into this this 21st century global civilization will continue to have problems. Now, what we need is a strategy to address all these problems. And the declaration that I mentioned offer a roadmap toward the recontextualization or reform of this classical Islamic discourse, or we can call it Islamic orthodoxy, that still have authority among many Muslims. Many Muslims still consider this classical discourse as authoritative guidance for Muslims. So we need to transform all this, not just transform the, not just to recontextualize the discourse, but also transform the mindset of the people, of Muslims. So then in the declaration, we offer 5 components of strategy. First, we need to honestly identify the problems and contain them. So identification and containment. We have identified these 4 center of concerns. It is an honest account about the problems. Now, and then we need to contain any, we need to contain any consequences of the existence of these problems, such as when some people then generate a movement based on this problematic ideas, such as what we are seeing nowadays with these extremist and terrorist movements around the world, because they want to stick to these problematic elements within Islamic discourse. So we need to contain them. The second thing is that the second component of the strategy is we need to strive, for conflict resolution, because any conflicts between different group of religion is a justification to the continuation of these problematic elements. The third component is of the strategy is providing alternative discourse. What is the alternative discourse, to the old classical discourse of Islamic laws in this very topics, in these centers of concern? See, in February 2019, the Nahdlatul Ulama had a gathering of ulamas, of their ulamas. Back then, there were thousands of ulamas, gathered together in a national conference of Nahdlatul Ulama in West Java. In that gathering, then, the ulamas of Nahdlatul Ulama ruled some fatwas regarding, precisely regarding these 4 centers of concern. The National Conference of Ulamas back then stated that, first, the category of non-Muslim or kafir is no longer relevant in the context of modern nation state. Because you know, every citizen, regardless differences in religion, should be equal before the law. No discrimination whatsoever. You know, that means that the category of kafir or non-Muslim, which in the previous discourse, in the classical Islamic discourse, you know, were subject to discrimination, is now no longer relevant in the context of modern nation state. Second, that pursuing an universal Islamic caliphate is not a religious obligation for Muslims. So Muslims should simply support, you know, the nation state, you know, model and the country where they dwell. The third fatwa is that Muslims should not use Sharia as the reason, you know, Muslims cannot contradict Sharia and the state laws, and should not use Sharia as justification to, you know, to go against, to defy the state laws, or even to rebel against the legitimate government. You know. If there is any contradictions between the Sharia and the nation and the state laws, then everything should be resolved in a democratic way, without violence. Now, the fourth fatwa is that whenever it happens, you know, whenever there's a conflict between a group of Muslims against a group of non-Muslims, the obligation for Muslim is not to join the conflict in the name of helping fellow Muslim, but the obligation is to, you know, to strive for peace, you know, to do efforts to have peace, you know. So these are alternative discourse. You know. These are alternative discourse. Now, that we offer, you know, that we offer to the world, to Muslim world, you know, and the fourth component of the strategy is reform in theological educational system, reform in the curriculum, reform in the method, and so forth, reform in the content of, you know, in this sense, Islamic education, Islamic educational system. Yeah. Because these problematic elements within the Islamic discourse are still taught until now as authoritative guidance for Muslims. You know. So we need to review this, you know, and have alternative on this. Now, the fifth component is social movement. We can only do it more effectively if we do it through a social movement. You know, the difference between, you know, various societies in Middle East and Indonesia, you know, one of the factors that make difference is the existence of social movement in Indonesia. In Indonesia, we have Muhammadiyah, we have Nahdlatul Ulama, you know, social movements that protect the integrity of the society. And the movement like this, you know, does not exist elsewhere. So we need social movement. These are thoughts, you know, that we have to, you know, that we offer to address this problem, this very difficult problem, you know. in Islamic discourse, in the Islamic model of civilization, when it comes to the necessity to integrate ourselves, the Muslim world harmoniously with the rest of the world. So now, do non-Muslims experts have rights also to talk about this, to join the discussion about this? Of course, of course, because Islam is not only for Muslims, and because non-Muslims, they have interest about Islam because it is in their concern also. If Islam cannot be integrated harmoniously with the rest of the world, then the rest of the world will be under threat, so to speak. It's going to be a great problem for the whole world if we fail to integrate Islam harmoniously with the rest of the world. So everybody, who dwells the same world where we live, he or she has the full right to join the discussion about Islam, especially about Islam and our current civilization. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Pak Kiai, for all of your answers to the conference or from Mr. Dr. Ibn Salama. I don't think we have more time now to give the opportunity for question and answer session. I think sufficient to say that it is very, I think we are all have a great honor to have all the speakers today to hear all the interesting materials and talks about in the context of universal human rights. And I need to conclude from Pak Kiai Yahya. I think all the materials presented by Pak Kiai Yahya are very stimulating, inspiring, as well as challenging to the future of the Islamic world, especially for Indonesia. And we have to be optimistic that the future of Indonesia comprises the bright future that all Muslims can accept or reconcile between the normative teaching of Islam and the concepts of modern human rights. To appreciate all the speakers, I think I need to thank all of the speakers, and let's give all the speakers a big applause for all presentations and points that delivered to us. And thank you very much for having all of the speakers in this international conference. May you all of us stay healthy and safety. I think that's all from me. We can see you in the near future. Thank you very much. Warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you. See you.
Ya, alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Telah kita ikuti bersama sesi plenary yang pertama. Kami ucapkan terima kasih kepada seluruh narasumber, kepada Bapak Yahya Khalil, Dr. Yur Michael, Dr. Ibrahim Salama, dan Bapak Amiruddin yang telah berbagi ilmu dan juga insight-nya. Tak lupa juga terima kasih kepada moderator, Bapak Profesor Masdar Hilmi, yang memimpin sesi diskusi plenari kita yang pertama hari ini. Semoga apa yang telah disampaikan dapat bermanfaat untuk kita semua, sesuai dengan tujuan konferensi internasional ini, di mana bisa menjadi forum diskusi mengenai konsepsi hak asasi manusia.
Hadirin yang kami hormati, dengan berakhirnya plenary session tadi, maka seluruh rangkaian acara hari pertama International Conference on Islam and Human Rights telah kita ikuti bersama.
Dan kami juga mengucapkan terima kasih kepada Bapak Ibu yang telah mengikuti acara ini, baik secara langsung maupun yang berpartisipasi secara daring. Kita akan lanjutkan kembali acara selanjutnya besok pada hari Sabtu tanggal 11 Desember 2021 dengan agenda yaitu sesi plenari yang kedua yang akan membahas mengenai sharing praktik baik terbaik dari berbagai negara atas corak keberislaman yang mengejawantahkan hak asasi manusia.
Dan tentunya dilanjutkan dengan sesi diskusi tematis yang akan dilaksanakan secara paralel.
Dengan kelas yang pertama, pembahasan mengenai Islam, hak asasi manusia, dan politik identitas.
Dengan kelas kedua, pembahasan mengenai Islam, hak asasi manusia, civil society, grassroots movement, and media.
Dan kelas yang ketiga, pembahasan mengenai Islam, hak asasi manusia, and public policy.
Akhir kata, saya Dilestari dan rekan saya,
Muhammad Mahmudi, kami pamit undur diri.
Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.